Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, Crossing New Frontiers to Conquer Today's Challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines and described as the African supercomputer genius that won top US prize. I won that supercomputer prize for my contributions to the development of the computer. I won that prize because I challenged the orthodoxy of supercomputing only one thing or solving only one problem at a time or solving the toughest problems in a step-by-step fashion. I was the first person to figure out how to massively parallel process across 1 million processors and how to solve a grand challenge problem and how to solve the most challenging problems across a new internet that is a new supercomputer and how to solve the toughest problems at the fastest supercomputer speeds. I've had the experience of each student of an entire school writing a school report on my contributions to the development of the computer. And writing the school report a week before I visited their school. During my school visits, I advised the students that inventing a never-before-seen supercomputer is far more complicated than a science fair project. I explained to students that the fastest parallel supercomputer is defined across an ensemble of over 10 million processors that occupies the space of a soccer field. The fastest supercomputer in the world costs more than the annual budget of the 40 poorest nations in the world. For that reason, it's impossible for a student or his entire school or sometimes country of origin to assemble or program a supercomputer. On February 1, 1922, parallel processing across a network of 64,000 human computers was published as a science fiction story. Back in 1958, the term parallel computer was first mentioned in the literature. Back in 1962, a 4-processor supercomputer was manufactured. At that time, harnessing the total computing power of 8 processors was perceived as the upper limit for all supercomputers. For 67 years, progress in the speed up of parallel supercomputers stopped. Paradigm shifting advances in supercomputing stopped because it was then impossible to solve a grand challenge problem and solve the problem by dividing the problem into a million or a billion smaller problems and then parallel supercomputing that grand challenge problem across a large ensemble of as many tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors. That barrier against parallel processing lasted for 67 years and gave rise to the saying that parallel supercomputing is a beautiful theory that lacked an experimental confirmation. Put differently, the practical parallel supercomputer was a grand challenge, a science fiction, an idea that was not positively true. Solving real-world problems, such as forecasting the weather and doing so across millions of processors, was science fiction back in the 1980s and earlier. In a historic debate that occurred at a computer conference in Silicon Valley, California, and occurred back in April 18 to 20, 1967, Gene Amdahl, the IBM supercomputer czar of Amdahl's laws fame, defeated Daniel Slotnick. Gene Amdahl's victory gave rise to the ubiquitous supercomputer term called Amdahl's law. In plain language, Amdahl's law decreed that parallel supercomputing will forever remain a huge waste of everybody's time. Fast forward 22 years after Amdahl's law entered into supercomputer textbooks, I was in the news headlines because I discovered on July 4, 1989 that the supercomputer textbooks were wrong and that parallel supercomputing is not a waste of time. The new parallel supercomputer knowledge that I discovered is codified into every supercomputer that has been manufactured since 1989. In the fastest computing or supercomputing of 1989 and later, a large ensemble of processors are harnessed and used to solve real-world problems and do so in parallel. Prior to my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing, processors that were not a member of an ensemble of processors were harnessed and used to solve only one real-world problem at a time. After my discovery, parallel supercomputing became the paradigm-shifting technology that changed the way we look at the supercomputer. The supercomputer costs the budget of a small nation and has an impact on the world that is in proportion to its cost. The invention of the parallel supercomputer was the culmination of a 7-decade-long journey that began as a science fiction story. That quest for the fastest supercomputer ended when I discovered how to solve in parallel one of the toughest problems arising in physics and mathematics. That science fiction that was first published on February 1, 1922, became a non-fiction during my parallel processing laboratory experiment that ended on my eureka moment of 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. Looking across millions of years of evolution, working together to solve a grand challenge problem is nothing new in the animal kingdom, where lions hunt in packs to kill an adult elephant. but solving the toughest problems arising at the crossroad, where physics, algebra, and calculus and computing met, and solving them across a new internet brought authority and clarity that ushered a supercomputer that was never seen before and that made the news headlines and that elevated the massively parallel supercomputer from fiction to non-fiction. Loosely speaking, parallel supercomputing is akin to multitasking with millions upon millions of processors. Humans want to be gods that perform organ transplants and IVF or in vitro fertilization and euthanasia or dignified death. I believe that the planetary-sized supercomputer that I first conceived in 1974 and that I described in my lectures of the early 1980s will take us closer to creating the golden calf, the god that our post-human descendants of year million will worship. Perhaps the god post-humans could try to revive as their all-powerful ruler. The deity that will control the minds of post-humans. The deity that could become the planetary superbrain of our year million post-human descendants. My two testbed problems were grand challenge initial boundary value problems that arose from extreme scale computational fluid dynamics. In the general circulation modeling of the motions of fluids that enshroud the Earth, three-dimensional circularity exists by definition. But in the simulation of the motions of the fluids inside a production oil field that is the size of a town, the crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that flows 1 mile deep and flows into and from each petroleum reservoir comes from the petroleum reservoirs that bounded it, except for the first and last petroleum reservoirs. Again, I visualized the entire oil field that I was simulating, and that is the size of a town as divided into 65,536 equal-sized oil fields. Please allow me to introduce myself. On August 26, 2000, then US President Bill Clinton talked about the contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the computer. In the days following President Bill Clinton's televised speech, I was inundated with inquiries about my contribution to supercomputing. A few days later, the Guardian newspaper of Nigeria wrote an 8-page spread on my contributions to the development of the computer. Despite that 8-page newspaper profile, I needed 80,000 pages to fully tell my story. Where do I begin my story? Do I begin with the laws of physics? Or do I begin with the technique of calculus? Or do I begin with algebra that was the bridge between physics and calculus? At a scientific conference, I introduced myself as a large-scale computational algebraist that figured out how to put algebra on the world's fastest supercomputer and in service to physics and calculus as well as to society. My discovery of the parallel supercomputer that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 that made the news headlines broke new grounds because I was the first person to figure out how to harness a new internet that was a new global network of a million or even a billion commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled and that were identical to each other. I figured out how to harness a billion processors and use them to solve the grand challenge problems that were once impossible to solve. That parallel supercomputer that was then science fiction became a reality, and a new computing machinery that was not a computer per se, but that was a new internet de facto. The important lesson is this: we cannot invent a new computer without also inventing a new computer science. Nor can we invent a new calculus without also extending the frontiers of knowledge and doing so at the interdisciplinary crossroad where mathematics and physics met. The genius is the ordinary person that found the extraordinary in the ordinary, and in her grand challenge, is to solve the toughest problem and do so as if it wasn't tough. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered that the massively parallel supercomputer is a tool that makes it possible for us to ask a grand challenge question and get the answer in only one day, instead of in 1,000 centuries. In computational physics, a problem that takes 180 years of time to solution is a grand challenge problem. That computation-intensive problem is solvable in 180 years, but is unsolvable in only one day. In supercomputing, the grand challenge is a problem that traverses the frontiers of the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science. The grand challenge is a problem such as global warming that is defined by the public, or a question that society wants to be answered now. In my supercomputing quest for how to solve the grand challenge problem, I discovered how to lift calculus out of the blackboard and into the motherboard and across a new internet that I visualized as a new global network of processors that is a new computer de facto. I discovered how to lift calculus out of the mathematics textbook or the WAEC and JAMB examinations, and how to put calculus into the mile-deep oil fields that each occupy the space of a town in the Niger Delta region of southeastern Nigeria. As a research supercomputer scientist, I see myself as a hunter or a predator, and my prey is the unknown. My quest is to know something nobody else knows. Back in 1989, the foremost vector supercomputer scientists couldn't understand how I parallel processed across a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled and identical processors. They couldn't understand how I was able to harness that new internet and use that new technology to record the highest speed increase of a factor of 65,536 and record the fastest supercomputer speed that made the news headlines. At first, my massively parallel processed supercomputer experimental results of the 4th of July was rejected as a quote-unquote terrible mistake. After 2 months of rejections, and on September 1, 1989, I took my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing to a 15-day hands-on vector supercomputing workshop that took place in the largest national laboratory in the Midwest region of the United States. That national lab was in Chicago, Illinois. I was invited to Chicago because the parallel supercomputer could become the enabling technology that must be harnessed when applying the computation-intensive mathematical physics that must be used to foresee natural hazards that threaten lives and livelihoods, as well as foresee long-term hazards such as global warming that threatens the health of planet Earth. The parallel supercomputer is the vital technology that must be used to supply timely, relevant, and useful information about the global motions of the fluids that enshroud planet Earth. The extraordinary importance of that supercomputer hopeful was the reason I was invited to the supercomputer workshop that was sponsored by the United States Department of Energy and that was held in the 15 days inclusive of September 1 to 15, 1989. On my first day at that supercomputer workshop, I was mocked and ridiculed because I claimed that I could parallel process across a new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 commodity processors that were identical to each other. I was offhandedly dismissed because I also claimed that I recorded the highest parallel processed speed increase. I recorded the fastest supercomputer speed in 1989, and I did so when everybody said that my speed was impossible to attain across the slowest processors in the world. But as that supercomputer workshop progressed, the supercomputer instructors learned that I had been supercomputing since June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon. They learned that I knew more about the parallel supercomputer than any supercomputer scientist knew. At that workshop, I gained credibility as an expert in parallel supercomputing. With each day that passed, I noticed that I was getting fewer and fewer mockeries of my parallel supercomputer discovery. By the 15th and last day of that supercomputer workshop, the majority of the attendees became convinced that I had achieved a breakthrough in parallel supercomputing. Yet, the few naysayers at that 15-day workshop taunted me to submit my parallel supercomputer calculations to the 4 supercomputer scientists and judges that award the top prize in the field of supercomputing. 5 months later, one of those naysayers called to congratulate me after he read the story about the African supercomputer genius that won top US prize. In retrospect, the rejections of my proof of principle of 1989 and of my experimental discovery of proof of principle of 1982 and of my experimental discovery of 1989 of the parallel supercomputer gave me street cred as the inventor of practical parallel supercomputing. I presented my proof of principle in November 1982, and I did so at a conference auditorium that was a short walk from the White House in Washington, D.C. The rejection that occurred on July 4, 1989, of my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing proved that I invented a new technology that was vital to the computer and to the supercomputer. Parallel supercomputing was first theorized in print as science fiction back on February 1, 1922. Practical parallel supercomputing was born in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, and entered into computer textbooks as non-fiction and did so after I discovered it. On July 4, 1989. It was at the International Computer Conference that took place on February 28, 1990 at the then Cathedral Hill Hotel in San Francisco, California, that practical parallel supercomputing was officially upgraded from science fiction to reality. At that computer conference, I was given the top prize in the field of supercomputing, and I was recognized for my contributions to the development of the computer. My contribution is this: I upgraded the parallel supercomputer from science fiction to reality. The rejections that I received proves one important thing, namely, parallel supercomputing was not obvious to the leading supercomputer scientists of 1989 and earlier. The idea of parallel supercomputing first came in print back on February 1, 1922. But practical parallel supercomputing remained a grand challenge until I discovered the technology 67 years later and discovered the technology across a new internet that is a new global network of commodity off-the-shelf processors, and discovered the technology on my eureka moment of 8:15 in the morning of July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. When I began my quest for the fastest supercomputer technology, I didn't have a supercomputer per se. I used a parallel processing ensemble that's a new internet de facto, and that's defined and outlined by 65,536 central processing units that were equal distances apart from each other and that shared nothing between each other. The supercomputer community of 1989 knew that each of my central processing units could only execute 47,303 calculations per second. That was the maximum sustained speed that I attained for the specific grand challenge problem that I was tasked to solve. In 1989, the leading minds in the world of supercomputer, such as Gene Amdahl and Seymour Cray, insisted that it will forever remain impossible to divide a grand challenge problem into smaller problems and then to parallel process that grand challenge problem and solve it across the slowest processors in the world and solve that grand challenge problem at the world's fastest supercomputer speed. In 1989, I was in the news headlines because I received the top prize in the field of supercomputing, and because the supercomputing community deduced that I integrated 47,303 calculations per second per central processing unit, and that I integrated those calculations across my new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 central processing units. My supercomputer experiment of July 4, 1989, that made the news headlines enabled me to reach the total supercomputing speed of 3.1 billion calculations per second. That was the fastest speed on record for solving grand challenge problems. That supercomputer calculation made the news headlines as a world record and was recorded in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. As a black supercomputer scientist that was born in Nigeria, Africa, I did not have the structural advantages that put Seymour Cray or Steve Jobs in their leadership positions and that made it possible for them to claim the credit for other inventors' inventions. In the past, it was a tradition in American science to reassign the credit for the invention of a black slave to his white owner. So it should not come as a surprise for me to say that vestiges from the past carried over to the present and that I was blackmailed and threatened to reassign the credit for my inventions to white non-inventors who could not give a public lecture on my inventions and who've known me for 7 years but yet could not even spell or pronounce my last name. Recently, Seymour Cray, the pioneer of vector supercomputers of the 1970s, was reassigned the credit for inventing the massively parallel supercomputer. Yet, it is well documented that Seymour Cray ridiculed, mocked, and dismissed the parallel supercomputer as a huge waste of everybody's time. In the 1980s, Seymour Cray taunted aspiring parallel supercomputer scientists and did so by asking them, quote, "If you were plowing a field, which would you rather use? 2 strong oxen or 1,024 chickens?" Unquote. Looking back to the 1980s, some scientists that fought to get the credit for my invention of practical parallel supercomputing were very self-regarding scientists and arrogant men with a strong sense of self-entitlement to getting undeserved credits. Some scientists were asked to apologize to Philip Emeagwali for plagiarizing, stealing, and publishing his inventions as their inventions. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The grand challenge problems of supercomputing are the toughest problems arising in mathematical physics. The modern supercomputer is an instrument that must be used to solve the toughest problems, such as general circulation modeling, to foresee otherwise unforeseeable climate changes. In 1989, I was in the news headlines because I discovered how to solve grand challenge problems and how to do so by dividing each problem into a million smaller problems and then parallel supercomputing them at lightning fast speeds and across as many processors. I was in the news headlines because I discovered how to solve once impossible problems and how to solve them across a new internet that is a new ensemble of 1 million processors that represents the as many brains of a new virtual supercomputer. What sets the new supercomputer apart from the old computer are these. The new supercomputer occupies the space of a soccer field. The new supercomputer have the combined speed of 1 million processors. In essence, my supercomputer is built from the same processor that your computer was built from. The crucial difference between a supercomputer and a computer is that the 1 million processors inside that supercomputer are integrated to become one seamless, cohesive virtual computer that is super, beyond super. This new supercomputer technology called parallel processing made the news headlines when I discovered it on the 4th of July 1989 and discovered it across an ensemble of 64 binary thousand processors that were identical to each other, that were tightly coupled to each other, and that shared nothing between each other. A massively parallel supercomputer that must be used to solve the toughest problem costs up to $1.25 billion and occupies the space of a soccer field and must be chilled to prevent its millions of processors or brains from overheating. In the 1970s and 80s, and since February 1, 1922, parallel supercomputing was on the drawing board. I worked alone on practical parallel supercomputing, and I did so at the time the technology was mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed as a huge waste of everybody's time. For 67 years, practical parallel supercomputing was a formidable foe of mathematicians and physicists. A teacher asked her students, "What is Philip Emeagwali noted for?" My answer is this: I invented practical parallel supercomputing, the vital technology inside today's supercomputers. Until 1989, using the parallel supercomputer to solve a grand challenge problem remained in the realm of science fiction. Consider this: at a parallel processed supercomputer speed of 1,000 million billion calculations per second, it would take a person performing one calculation per second 31.75 billion years, or nearly twice the age of the universe, to solve a grand challenge problem that would take that supercomputer only 1 second to solve. Parallel processing revolutionized the way we think about the fastest supercomputers that must solve millions of problems at once instead of solving a grand challenge problem and solving it in the step-by-step serial processing fashion that was the prevailing paradigm since the programmable computer was invented back in 1946. The parallel supercomputer is a technological revelation that is standing the test of time. The parallel supercomputer is a critical technology that makes the impossible to compute possible to compute. For that reason, the stake on the new supercomputer was so high that the United States added a Russian supercomputer maker to its list of nuclear threats. It's a crime for a US company to sell a supercomputer to a quote-unquote unfriendly nation. In China, it's also a crime to export Chinese supercomputer technology to the United States. In Japan, it's also a crime for me, Philip Emeagwali, who is a non-Japanese, to browse through the operating instructions of supercomputers that were made in Japan, even though I invented practical parallel processing as the vital technology that underpins every supercomputer that is made in Japan. It's a crime to export US supercomputers because the parallel supercomputer is de facto a weapon of mass destruction. The fastest supercomputer provides the horsepower for secretly simulating nuclear explosions and doing so in parallel and across an ensemble of millions of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. That was the reason the United States government classified the parallel processed solution of initial boundary value problems to be grand challenge problems. After all, solving this once impossible problem transcends abstract mathematics. The solution of the grand challenge problem of mathematical physics is a positive contribution to human progress. For my contribution is this: I invented a new internet that is a new supercomputer. On February 1, 1922, a science fiction story was published. That science fiction story described how 64,000 human computers around the world could work together to forecast the weather. 67 years after that science fiction story, and at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1989, I experimentally discovered how to harness a new internet that is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors, and how to harness them to forecast the weather around the world. My invention, called practical parallel processing, made the news headlines around the world. The typical news headlines was African supercomputer genius wins top US prize. Back in 1989, I was in the news because I discovered how to bring that science fiction story that was published in 1922 to reality. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The supercomputer technology that I invented is called parallel processing. A new parallel supercomputer is one that has never before seen processor to processor configuration. Parallel processing enables millions upon millions of processors operating inside the modern supercomputer to communicate and compute, and to do both as one seamless cohesive unit that is a virtual supercomputer. Parallel processing enables the supercomputer that is powered by 1 million processors to be 1 million times faster than the computer that is powered by only one processor. The parallel supercomputer moves humanity forward and into the future. Hopefully, as we move forward by parallel processing across a global network of computers around the earth, then our children's children could build their planetary-sized supercomputer that could someday become one and the same thing as their internet. Today, parallel processing is vital to every supercomputer manufactured and may become vital to every computer of the future. I was in major newspapers because I experimentally discovered how and why parallel processing makes the modern computer faster and makes the modern supercomputer fastest. Please allow me to take a retrospective look on how I discovered how to program a new internet named the Philip Emeagwali Internet. That new internet is a new global network of 65,536 processors, or 65,536 identical computers. I visualize those processors as equal distances apart and on the surface of a globe within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. I discovered how to program that new internet as one seamless, cohesive whole supercomputer that was not a computer per se, but that was a virtual supercomputer de facto. I discovered how to program that new internet as a new supercomputer and how to email and control my 65,536 processors, and how to do both without seeing or touching any of those processors. I discovered how to program and harness the processors that outline and define that new internet and control them blindfolded. I discovered how to program and harness the processors that outline and define that new internet and control them blindfolded. I discovered how to divide a grand challenge problem into 1 million smaller problems and how to solve those 1 million challenging problems at once. Some scientists try to position themselves to take the credit for my inventions. A few succeeded. I have documentations to prove the complete plagiarism of my invention. A parallel processed supercomputer that has thousands of processors encircling a globe that I invented alone was plagiarized by a team of seasoned researchers that received United States federal funding to do so. I distinguish between intentional and unintentional plagiarism. Those researchers stole my invention in its entirety and did not contribute to my invention. Those researchers merely removed my name as the inventor of the Philip Emeagwali supercomputer and put their names as its inventors. As a supercomputer inventor that came of age in the 1980s, I felt like the songwriter that was not credited for the songs that he wrote. And I felt like the painter that was not allowed to sign his name on his original paintings. For me, the toughest part about being a black inventor is getting the full credit for the new supercomputer that I invented alone. Back in 1989, I was perceived as a difficult person to work with and perceived as such by research scientists who never worked with me. The reason was that I made it impossible for someone else to take the credit away from me and do so for the practical parallel supercomputing technology that I invented alone. I wasn't a difficult person to work with. Those researchers that tried to steal the credit from me were difficult persons to work with. That problem of how to increase the speed of the modern supercomputer and increase that speed by a factor of 1 million was the grand challenge problem of mathematical physics that was posed back in February 1, 1922, and that I solved on July 4, 1989. I discovered how to solve in only one day and across that new internet that is a parallel supercomputer, and how to solve a grand challenge problem that would have taken millennia upon millennia of time to solution on one computer. For 67 years, onward of February 1, 1922, parallel processing was abandoned by supercomputer experts. Supercomputer textbooks dismissed parallel processing as science fiction. Parallel supercomputing was ridiculed as a huge waste of everybody's time. Because my massively parallel supercomputer was an unconventional technology and a new internet, I used an unorthodox technique to send and receive my 65,536 computational physics codes that I had to email to my as many processors of my new internet. Deep inside the parallel supercomputer, the email is the recurring decimal across each pair of bidirectional email wires that connects nearest neighboring processors that shared nothing. I had 65,536 unique email addresses for as many processors. Each processor operated its own operating system. Each email address was 16 bits long, or a unique string of 16 zeros and ones. My email addresses within that new internet were unorthodox because they had no @signs or .com suffixes. Their @signs and suffixes were unnecessary because I knew where my 65,536 processors that outlined and defined my new internet were at. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing began with some back-of-the-envelope calculations and a few proof-of-principle lectures in which I presented my realizations that 1,000,000 processors could in principle be harnessed to solve the toughest problems arising in mathematics, physics, and computer science. My proof of concept was small and was not complete. I gave my proof of principle lectures back in the early 1980s. At that time, parallel processing across 16 times 2 raised to power 16 or 1 binary million bidirectional email wires was the frontier and the unknown territory and the science fiction of the world of the supercomputer. 67 years earlier, a meteorologist presented as science fiction the story of 64,000 human computers working together to solve a grand challenge problem such as forecasting the weather around the entire planet Earth. That science fiction story was published back on February 1, 1922. But unlike the science fiction writer, I, as a non-fiction, research massively parallel supercomputer scientist, had a very limited number of words that I can use to describe how I emailed my initial boundary value problems of mathematical physics and how I sent them across a never-before-seen internet. That is a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. As a supercomputer scientist, I'm different from the science fiction writer because the starting point of the science fiction writer is a blank page plus the unlimited fictional stories that she can conjecture and that she can use to populate her blank pages. But as the first parallel supercomputer scientist that started his quest for the solution of grand challenge problems and started on a conventional supercomputer and started on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, United States, and continued almost daily for 15 years and continued to the capital of supercomputing, namely Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. And as that first modern supercomputer scientist, I couldn't make up fictional stories that could not be reconfirmed by each and every subsequent parallel supercomputer scientist. As the non-fiction supercomputer scientist that I was, I could not write a word about practical parallel supercomputing and do so until I, first and foremost, divided my grand challenge problem into smaller, less challenging problems and then synchronously emailed them across my 1 binary million email wires that interconnected my processors and then simultaneously solved them with the one-to-one problem-to-processor correspondence that I maintained between my 64 binary thousand smaller mathematical physics problems and my as many commodity off-the-shelf processors that shared nothing between each other. My first discovery of practical parallel supercomputing that occurred on the 4th of July 1989 was rejected as a quote-unquote terrible mistake. Back in 1989 and earlier, practical parallel supercomputing was mocked, ridiculed, and rejected as a pitiful theory that lacked an experimental confirmation. My supercomputing quest was to experimentally confirm massively parallel supercomputing and reconfirm it to a speed limit that was never before attained, namely across a never before seen internet that was my new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors. For that invention of a new supercomputer, I used the toughest problems in mathematical physics as my computational test bed. The poster girl of the 20 grand challenge problems is the petroleum reservoir simulation of a production oil field that may be 2 miles below the surface of the earth and the size of a town. The reason 1 in 10 supercomputers were purchased by the petroleum industry was that the parallel processed petroleum reservoir simulator helps the oil company to discover and recover as much crude oil and natural gas as is possible, and to recover them as long as possible, as well as to compute them at a supercomputer speed that was previously believed to exist only in the realm of science fiction. The speed increase of a factor of 65,536 that I recorded on July 4, 1989 was dismissed as science fiction, and I was disinvited from giving my lecture on how I discovered practical parallel supercomputing. My discovery of the practical parallel supercomputing was rejected as quote-unquote a serious mistake. After 2 months of continuous rejections of my discovery of massively parallel supercomputing, I went in search of reconfirmation of my discovery. I was compelled to provide expert eyewitnesses to my discovery of the practical parallel supercomputing. My first step was at a 15-day-long supercomputer workshop that took place from September 1 to 15, 1989, and in Chicago, United States. During that supercomputer workshop, I spent the first 15 days building the trust and confidence of the supercomputer workshop instructors and participants who at that time did not know who I was. From my contributions to the workshop discussions on how to record the fastest speeds within the parallel supercomputer, the instructors realized that I had been supercomputing for the past 15 years and that they knew less than I did. On the 15th and last day of that supercomputer workshop, I suddenly cleared my throat and made the announcement that brought me to Chicago, namely that I've discovered practical parallel processing. You could hear a pin drop in the room as everybody gazed at me in stunned silence. For the first time since June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, United States, a group of supercomputer scientists attentively listened to me as I explained to them how I discovered how to massively parallel process across 65,536 processors that each operated its own operating system. I discovered how to reduce the calculation time of the 20 grand challenge problems of supercomputing. I discovered how to reduce that time to solution and do so with a speed up of 65,536. Before September 15, 1989, my speed up of 65,536 days, or 108 years of time to solution to just one day, existed only in the realm of science fiction. For me, Philip Emeagwali, that Eureka moment in Chicago was surreal. After my announcement at that supercomputer workshop of my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing, it was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop in the room. The supercomputer scientists attending that Chicago workshop challenged me to submit my discovery to the highest authority in supercomputing. That highest authority was the Computer Society of the IEEE. The IEEE is the acronym for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. In late December 1989, the Computer Society reconfirmed my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing. The Computer Society invited me to come to the forthcoming International Computer Conference that will take place on February 28, 1990 in San Francisco, California. 2 months prior to that conference, the Computer Society of the IEEE sent out a press release that recognized my contributions to quote-unquote practical parallel processing. In their press release, the Computer Society announced that I have won the highest award in the field of supercomputing. I'm well known, but not known well. I'm well known for inventing a new internet that is a new supercomputer de facto, and that is a new global network of 65,536 processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. I'm well known for figuring out how to harness the processors within that new internet and how to use that new knowledge to solve initial boundary value problems arising in mathematical physics that were otherwise impossible to solve. But I am not known well for foreseeing my discovery as de facto a new internet. I'm well known for experimentally discovering or recording speeds in floating point arithmetical computations that were previously unrecorded. But I am not known well for using email communications across that new internet to record communication speeds that were previously unrecorded. But I am not known well for discovering or seeing for the first time those supercomputer speeds and recording them across my new internet. But I am not known well for changing the way we look at the modern computer and the modern supercomputer. After the 4th of July 1989, I became known for the experimental discovery of parallel supercomputing. That discovery made the news headlines because it was beyond theory and beyond the computer, and because it was specific, quantifiable, and measurable. Every new technology has a starting point. parallel processing is the starting point of the modern supercomputer. In the 1970s and 80s, the supercomputer hopeful technology called parallel processing was mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed as a huge waste of everybody's time. Today, parallel processing is universally used to reduce the time to solution of the toughest problems arising in the field of supercomputing. Parallel processing is used to increase the speed of the fastest computers and all supercomputers. My discovery of practical parallel processing was how I entered as a benchmark into the history of the development of the computer and the internet. In US public libraries, I see 12-year-olds writing school reports on the contributions of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the computer. I entered into school curricula after my discovery of practical parallel supercomputing. That discovery occurred on the 4th of July 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing made the news headlines because it was new knowledge that changed the way we look at the supercomputer. My discovery of practical parallel supercomputing was recorded in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. At its core essence, parallel supercomputing is about 1 billion processors computing together to solve one big problem. Parallel supercomputing is the vanguard of computer science. The parallel supercomputer is the engine that is used to discover new knowledge and solve grand challenge problems arising in STEM fields. My contribution to the development of the computer is this: I discovered that we can parallel process and solve grand challenge problems arising in mathematics and physics and solve them across a new internet, that is a new global network of commodity off-the-shelf processors that shared nothing between them. I paradigm shifted from computing only one thing at a time or in sequence to supercomputing 1 million things at once or in parallel. I was the first person to solve a grand challenge problem and solve it by dividing it into smaller problems and communicating them via emails to 65,536 processors. I was the first person to solve as many as 65,536 parallel processed initial boundary value problems of mathematical physics and solve them at once. My discovery, called practical parallel processing, is the vital technology that must be used to solve the toughest problems arising in science and engineering and used to solve them in minimum time. When I began sequential supercomputing on June 20, 1974, at age 19, parallel supercomputing then only existed in the realm of science fiction. For the 67 years onward of February 1, 1922, parallel supercomputing only existed as an urban legend of the mathematical physics community. My parallel supercomputing experiment made the news headlines back in 1989. But my discovery of the fastest computer speed was not newsworthy for pushing the boundaries of how fast supercomputers could compute. My discovery was newsworthy because I discovered the fastest speeds across a new internet that I described as a new global network of 65,536 processors that tightly encircled a globe. That discovery enabled the supercomputer to be true to its vital technology that is named parallel processing. Parallel processing revolutionized the field of supercomputing by giving it new horizons that ranges from the mathematician's blackboard to the engineer's drawing board. The serial processed weather forecast is unpredictable. We parallel process the grand challenge problem of weather forecasting to make unpredictable weather predictable. The speed of a computer can be increased by packing more transistors on chips and or putting more central processing units and graphics processing units and using them as identical cores and nodes of a global network of processing units that are equal distances apart and that are on the surface of a globe. Why is the supercomputer of today much faster than the supercomputer of 1988 and earlier? The modern supercomputer is faster because its underlying parallel processing units did the supercomputing. The processor is the brain of the computer. In the modern computer, the serial kernel of an application code is computed within a few central processing units that each computed only one thing at a time. In the modern supercomputer, the parallel kernel of an application code is parallel computed within the graphics processing unit that computed many things at once or in parallel. The graphics processing unit is a parallel processing tool that is used by the central processing unit to perform faster computations, just like the central processing unit is a sequential processing tool that is used by the sequential processing human computer to perform faster computations. The graphics processing unit is a massively parallel machine, and its presence inside your computer redefined your computer as parallel processing. The graphics processing unit computes in parallel or computes many things at once. The graphics processing unit computes the computation-intensive kernel of your application and did so when that kernel could be parallelized. The few cores within the central processing unit serially computed the portion of the computation-intensive physics code that could not be parallelized. If the central processing unit is the brain of your computer, then the graphics processing unit is the soul of your computer. The word computer was coined 2,000 years ago when it was first used by the Roman author Pliny the Elder. For 2,000 years, the word computer referred to a human computer that computes manually rather than to a programmable electronic machine that computes automatically. When the mid-20th century British logician Alan Turing and his contemporaries wrote about the quote-unquote computer, they meant a human computer not an electronic machine that computes. The meaning of the word computer changed in 1946 when the terminology, quote-unquote, programmable digital computer was shortened to computer. For my 1989 discovery of practical parallel processing, the technology that underpins every modern supercomputer, I had to redefine the programmable digital computer. I redefined the technology because I discovered how to divide a grand challenge problem into smaller problems and how to solve them across my new internet, that is a new global network of 65,536 processors. Each processor operated its own operating system. As predicted in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal, my experimental discovery of practical parallel processing opened the door to the modern supercomputer technology that is harnessed and used to solve real-world problems and solve them across central processing units that accelerate their speeds of computation and do so with identical graphics processing units. As a supercomputer scientist that came of age in the 1970s and 80s, I thought of the supercomputer differently. Conventional supercomputer scientists program vector supercomputers and believed that the fastest computations could only be recorded on one central processing unit, that's a vector unit. In the old paradigm of supercomputing, they thought of the supercomputer in the singular sense, or solving only one problem at a time. In my new paradigm of supercomputing, I thought of the supercomputer in the plural sense of 65,536 identical central processing units and as many identical graphics processing units. Back in 1989, I was in the news headlines because I experimentally discovered how to use those units to solve 65,536 problems at once. My discovery opened the door to the present technology of using graphics processing units where possible and using them to accelerate the speed of the floating point arithmetical operations that must be executed by the modern parallel supercomputer. My experimental discovery of how to parallel process and do so to solve the toughest problems and do so across a new global network of 65,536 processors was achieved across a new internet. The supercomputer of today will become the computer of tomorrow. The supercomputer is at once able to define our past, recreate our present, and reinvent our future. The supercomputer technology called massively parallel processing that was mocked as a very useless technology is now the front and the center of high-performance computing and is rapidly moving into laptops and desktops. Until the 4th of July 1989, parallel processing was not verified by any experiment that was conducted across an ensemble of thousands of processors and that used a real-world grand challenge problem as its computational testbed. My contribution to the development of the modern computer is this. On the 4th of July 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, United States, I provided the lockdown experimental evidence that the technology of massively parallel supercomputing can be harnessed and used to solve the toughest problems arising from mathematics to medicine and from science to engineering. I alone conducted that time-consuming experimentation that led to my discovery of the best way to get millions of processors to solve the toughest problems and to move humongous data into and out of storage and to solve them in harmony and as one seamless, cohesive supercomputer. The electricity budget of the email messaging that is a precondition to moving data into and out of millions upon millions of processors raises the electricity bill to up to $40 million per year and eventually costs more than the next world's fastest supercomputer that will cost the United States $600 million in the year 2023. The world's fastest computer consumes as much electricity as 2 million Nigerians. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture. Insightful and brilliant lecture.